this is Lauren Hollows for NOI Education Services, and today we are talking about mapping. How far do I need to go in my mapping? And what I'm actually going to do for you guys is we're actually just going to show you an example of what is covered in an NOI mapping guide, why we go down to the level that we go down to, and just talk through that particular process. So let me share my screen with you. Okay, so I guess the first thing that I want to talk about is what we cover in a mapping guide. So obviously we have all the normal guff up the top. We do cover a little bit about the delivery information. So the types of assessments we have, the assessment methods and the assessment types. Now that comes directly from the, basically like the how to build an assessment tool or what is good assessment, best practice assessment from the ASCWA series. And it's worthwhile downloading that guide and taking a look at that. We then have this little validation section that the RTO SME completes prior to rolling the tool out, which shows that they've done their own validation. Now, they generally don't need to contextualize because our tools already come contextualized. So they just write in there the context and the conditions and how we've already contextualized the tool, but it shows that they've done their own validation prior to actually rolling the tool out, which is a requirement for all RTOs, and it's the guidance provided by ASCWA. Now, then what we cover is we cover the elements and the performance criteria. We cover the foundation skills. We cover the performance evidence, the knowledge evidence, and the assessment conditions. Okay, now with the assessment conditions, we don't go into a lot of detail. Generally, like for example, on this one, we refer to the TAS because that's going to have the equipment, and then this just is a requirement for the trainers. And so we say, refer to the TAS and refer to like the assessor policy sort of thing. If it's something a little bit more explicit, like assessment in the workplace, we'll put a comment in there as to how we've designed the assessment specifically, like what component is done in workplace and what component is done in simulation, that sort of thing. So that's what we cover. Now, the reason why we cover that is because of this here, which is obviously the principles of assessments validity. Oh, Lord. And it's this criteria here, which says validity requires assessment against the unit of competency and the associated assessment requirements covers the broad range of skills and knowledge that are essential to competent performance. Okay, so obviously the units of competence is the elements, performance criteria, foundation skills. And then the associated assessment requirements is the performance evidence, knowledge evidence, assessment conditions. So that's why we have all of it in there. That's why we have all of it mapped. I have seen, and I believe that it's more than fair, that when ASCWA audits you, they can audit you against all of that because it literally says it there in black and white that is what the unit has to be against, okay? And if the reason why we use a mapping guide, you can go back and check out the last video that we put out as to why we believe that is the best method. It's our experience, and obviously everyone's experience is different. There is no requirement to have a mapping guide, but in my experience, it is the best and clearest way to provide that information to a range of audiences so that if it is being audited, validated, checked by the trainer, whatever, the information is very clear as to where you find it, okay? So a couple of potentially controversial things that you guys will see in here. Okay, so obviously a lot of people will have like multiple columns, like they'll have one for their knowledge questions and they'll have one for their practical. Some people will have them for their learning resources as well. I do actually really like having a column for your learning resources. NOI produces specifically assessments, not learning resources. So obviously that's why ours don't cover that. But it would make sense if, you then had another column where you mapped where your learning resources were. So that's one thing, like whether it's one column or multiple columns, like I don't really think it needs to, as long as it's going to be clear. As you can see here, we've got Q means A1 and it's part of the question bank, and A means it's part of AT2, which is part of the practical. And that's how we've kind of divided ours up. And then I'll also reference in there if there's like, for example, a specific template or an additional form of evidence that we're collecting for this. So that's how we structure ours. Now, one of the things that you're going to see in here is that I don't have a question against every performance criteria. I do not like having that. There is a couple of reasons for that. One, I believe that when you are mapping your summative assessment, it should be clear and concise. And I see overmapping all of the time. And it's problematic because when I, as the auditor, the assessor, the validator, are trying to collect and see where that evidence is covered, if you've mapped it to 27 questions, you know, and I pick the first 4 questions, and in every single one of those 4 questions, it's so loosely mapped, you know, I start to have concerns that, like, where is it that you've actually covered this? Like, where have you actually covered it? Like, not, yes, I can see loose connections to like everything because the unit is about like a particular topic. Where is the evidence for it? So I like things to be relatively concise when it comes to that. The other thing is that the majority of performance criteria are skills, okay? They're not knowledge. Things like where we've got identify, absolutely, yep, a question may be relevant for that. But for the vast majority of things, promote team involvement, communicate, manage reports, establish processes, use systems, implement systems, maintain systems. These are things that we need to do. So the vast majority of this should be focused in and around activities that are done. And when you start to like map questions in for everything, people then start to go, oh, but we've covered that in the mapping. Well, you've mapped it, but it's a skill that you've mapped to a question, which is just knowledge. So therefore, the student hasn't actually demonstrated the skill in what you've mapped. It becomes really problematic. The majority of the time, I believe it becomes problematic. And if it is a skill, then keep it to your skills, which means it should be linked to like an observation checklist or a document. Like, you know, if for example, it's, you know, manage reports and recommendations, it may be a report. You know, if it's, I don't know, promote team involvement, it could be like done through like an email encouraging employees to participate in something, you know. If it's implement new systems, a supporting document may be the new system or process or something like that. But if it's a skill, it should be linked to a skill that is observed, right? And that you are collecting evidence, and the evidence is going to be like an observation checklist or like something tangible that the student has created from that. Okay, so that's what we do. I hate seeing X's. I think you're silly. I don't even think you should bother. If all you're going to do is put in X's, don't bother mapping. Honestly, like, tell me the question that you're mapping it to, because if I go through and I say, you know, like there's 4 columns, and then in the practical column of, you know, for where the practical activity occurs, it's just X for everything. I'm like, it's lazy. It makes it impossible to actually audit and validate unless you're going to run it through like a separate system. You're remapping, you're having to remap the entire thing anyway. As an auditor and an assessor, it's very frustrating. And for me personally, if I have ASQA or TAC or VRQA auditing my work, the last thing that I want to do is go here, hand something through to them that I know is going to piss them off and frustrate them. Why would you do that? Why would you not make it clear? And personally, for yourself, if you're going through the process of mapping something, you know, when you go back and check yourself, if you've just put an X there, you have no idea where you've covered it. Take the time to actually put where you've covered it. So I want to go through and just like show a couple of examples of how we've done that in these particular, you know, in these particular units. So, and I guess the last thing that I will point out on that is that some criteria have multiple steps to it. So this is a really good example here, and this comes through in a lot of units. Implement, monitor, and update improvement plans, processes, and procedures to improve performance. So in this one, my A3, which means my third activity that I've done, okay, that's where the implementation comes in. And then in activity 4 is where the monitoring and updating has come into it. Okay, so, you know, like something like that for an auditor makes life a lot easier because I know where I'm supposed to look for specific information. And then when it comes to these sorts of things, and when it comes to the observation checklists, we are very explicit. So this is what I would call micro mapping. So for example, this skill, which is just super common in so many units, communicate effectively. What I'll do is I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger for people to see. Okay, so communicate effectively to support implementation of improvements and improve system and processes. So basically what they're doing is like, for example, in a rollout, they might be like talking about the new processes. They might do that through a toolbox meeting. They might do that through a formal email. They might do that through a formal training session, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. But what they're doing is they're communicating. They're talking about the policies and the processes to staff in this activity. Like that's what we want to see. We want to see them being able to communicate what the policy and the process is. Okay, so I can see in here, I've mapped this to A1.4, 2.2, and 4.4, which means I've mapped it to an activity, and that's activity 1, 2, and 4. They're demonstrating that, and then in the observation checklist, it's going to be like 0.4, 0.2, and 0.4. Okay, so if I go and I look at 2.2, okay, so during activity 2, they use clear and concise language. For example, they explain key terms, they define goals, and they keep language practical. The tone of voice, pace, and register are professional and appropriate. Okay, so personally for me, if we're talking about you're communicating things to support processes, okay, within the context of that assessment, they are using, like they are clearly communicating, and then these are some of my benchmarks for what good communication looks like. So, you know, if they've got a key term, they're going to explain what that key term is. They're going to keep language nice and practical. This is contextualized for civil construction. The tone of voice, pace, and register are professional and appropriate. And I would make it as like, I make an assumption at that point that a business trainer knows what that means. Okay. You can go into it obviously in more detail if you want. We've also covered this through 4.4. So was that right? 4.4? Yeah, 4.4. Okay. So here they've developed a report, written communication that is respectful, professional, and demonstrates a clear understanding of the data being reviewed and processed. And that was as part of a final report on the continuous improvement process, because this was all about continuous improvement processes for the learner. And then my last one was 1.4. So they developed a PowerPoint with information that contained clear and concise language that makes sense to the audience and allows for discussion in relation to specific data and information. Okay, so, you know, again, through here, the focus is obviously communication, but what we've provided within there is just really clear benchmarks of what good communication looks like. And obviously this is a business unit, it's contextualized for civil construction, it's at an AQF4 level. And so therefore effective communication at that level is quite, like I expect professionalism. So we've got a combination of written communication and verbal communication that supports implementation and improvements. And obviously like that, for that part there, we've got to look at like the actual tasks. So again, like if we just go to task 2, Undertake consultation with the WHS team, outline the results of the risk review process, outline recommendations made to date, promote team involvement in decision-making, and agree on the improvements that need to be made moving forward. So, you can see that that's all in relationship to, in this particular case, the risk review process, and the outcomes of that risk review process and how that process can be improved. Okay. And then here, they're 6 months post the initiative. They've reviewed and updated the data. They then have to create, they then have to create a short report to management on the outcomes achieved and further changes that can be required. Now, obviously, and in this particular case, like, we have that a huge amount of templates that then go on to support that and provide even further benchmarks about like what good communication looks like. So my guess would be to do in this, oh my gosh. In this particular case, we've got a handbook. So we've got a draft handbook, and then we've got a finalized handbook, which kind of shows like all of the benchmarks that we would expect. And so that has a whole bunch of then additional like supporting information once it loads up. It's not a blank document. Oh, internet's just terrible today. So yeah, so just kind of, further benchmarks for a lot of those things are going to be found in there. This is just like an example of one of the documents that we build. So for this one, we've got kind of, we've got our draft version of the booklet, and then we've got the finalized version of the booklet, which shows the expected kind of changes in the policies and procedures and stuff like that we would expect to see, and examples of good communication at this particular level. So yeah, so that's the reason why we do it. But as you guys can see, when someone's going through an audit and they're like, I hadn't really looked at this unit beforehand, which I probably should have done. But anyway, I'm pretty comfortable with all of our tools. It was super clear how communication was involved in every single one of those points. If I had just done A1, A2, A4, okay, or if I just had a practical column of like, here's the practicals and it's covered somewhere in the practical, I don't want my auditor to have to look through here and go, okay, so where have they covered communication? Like, if you've copy and pasted it, yeah, they can probably get that pretty easily. But the point is that we don't copy and paste the criteria across. We're putting in the benchmarks instead. And so therefore, it needs to be clear. But an auditor can look at that and go, have they evidenced communication? Well, we've evidenced that the student can use clear and concise language. We've evidenced that they can use clear and concise language in PowerPoint, so both in written format. We've evidenced that, they can create content that makes sense for their audience. We've evidenced that they, can be respectful and professional in the language that they provide. Like, that's all different aspects of good communication. And all of that is in context of updating, writing, and talking about the policies and procedures of the company, which is exactly what that criteria is supposed to cover, right? That's what we want. And that's kind of why that's why we go to this level of mapping, because, this is my only way to communicate to someone that this has been done correctly. This is the only way that, like, often I won't actually have the chance to sit with every person who's looking at this document, with every auditor or performance assessor that's looking at this document. So I want to be able to provide something to people where they can look at it and go, oh yeah, I can see where that's covered. Document performance to identify further opportunities for improvement. Yep, I can see how they're covering that in a report where, like, literally the instruction says, it's 6 months post your initiative, review the updated data and provide a short report to management on the outcomes achieved, right? And pretty sure if I go down to the end here. So this is we've provided an initial set of data. So again, yeah, this is like our initial set of data about like near misses. and recordable injuries. And then what we've then got is examples of different types of reports that the students might produce. And then we've got a second set of data. So like as we said, 6 months after, you know, we've provided that second set of data. And then from that, the students then going to produce a report doing a comparison between the two data sets and identifying, you know, whether or not the system has actually made a difference. So, you know, again, like to me, if we're talking about like monitoring, reviewing data, reviewing a second set of data, looking at whether or not it's made an impact, where the area of impact is, you know, it's just very clear where we find the information. It doesn't need to be overly complex. But, you know, anyone should be able to look at the assessment and go, if I follow this mapping guide, this is my yellow brick road. If I follow my yellow brick road, can I see evidence where this is nice and clearly covered? You know, that's what we're looking for in a good mapping guide. It is a very clear roadmap for how we've covered everything. And for me, like I always go back, because we often like will provide a unit and, you know, the first version might be contextualized for the business environment. And then we have to go back and we update it specifically for the civil construction environment. And, you know, somebody may contact me today and go, well, we've got that, but like we're doing it in a rail environment, or we're doing it in childcare, or we're doing it in aged care. And so we'll have to tweak all of these things again, right? And when I go back through and I update the unit for the new context, it's super easy for me to make sure that I have covered that particular point to the breadth and depth, so that an assessor can pull the relevant information, and so that the RTO can produce very clear, valid, sufficient evidence of competency. If you go through and do this activity and you don't know where to find it, you can't find it, you're not quite sure how it links, your mapping is not good enough. Like that's my personal opinion, is that in that particular case, your mapping is not good enough if it is not clear where the information is being found. So that's the reason why we go to the level that we do. I am sure that there are going to be people that are going to comment on this and say, that's too in-depth, that's ridiculous, you know, that's the way that we operate. It does not take me that long to map to this level of detail. I always have my mapping guide and my assessment open, so I live map as I go through the whole process. I never go through, create the assessment, and then go back and map it after. I think that's it just doesn't make sense to me. I have staff that like to work in the learner's version first, and then they do the assessor's version and add in those additional benchmarks. I personally like to work in the assessor's version because I put all of my benchmarks in as I'm doing it, as I'm mapping, just because that makes, for me, it makes it nice and easy. But this is our process for mapping. I think it's a very robust process. You are welcome. Please disagree with me below if you think I've gotten this wrong. It's not that time consuming when, you know, and as I said, like it saves you down the track when you're doing your validations and stuff. It's super clear where all of the information is, and that's how I believe it should be. I would love to know how you guys do mapping, what you think about mapping, what your experiences have been. Please feel free to comment below if you found value in this. Like, subscribe, do all of those good things. Comment. If you've been watching a couple of our videos and you kind of like, you know, if you want to like and comment on a few of them, send us an email. We can send you out a PD questionnaire. You can answer that based on a couple of the videos, and then we can issue you with your professional development certificate. It's just kind of like a helpful free service that we offer for vet professionals out there, because I know it's, you know, it's hard to do a lot of this sort of stuff. I hope you found this helpful. God, I don't even know how long I've been going for, but probably too long. Hope you found this helpful. Thank you so much, guys. Have a great day. My name is Lauren Hollows for NOI Education Services.